everybody. I'm happy to be here with you today, and the topic that we're going to explore is implicit bias. And though it isn't a new field of study, it is certainly one that's gained popularity recently. And I think that one explanation for this newfound attention is that it's really created an entree into some very difficult topics of inequity and injustice that have plagued our society. And so I think it provides an avenue for more open and honest dialogue because it takes some of the shame and blame out of the equation. So, over the next 25 minutes, we are going to gain a better understanding of what implicit bias is and how it impacts our perceptions and thought patterns. We'll be watching a short video and then delving deeper into some of the neurological and societal explanations for it. So we're also going to reflect on the manifestations and impacts of implicit bias in a school environment, connecting, as Denzel said, how does implicit bias impact me and my role as a teacher and my relationship with students? And finally, we will look at the ways that we can address implicit bias in ourselves and also on an institutional level in schools. So just a little disclaimer here. This presentation really focuses primarily on implicit bias as it relates to race, but certainly we know that implicit bias plays out with regards to many different identities such as gender, immigrant status, social or sexual orientation, class, religion, etc. So just keeping that in mind as we go through this. Okay. So we're going to start by watching a short video that was produced by the New York Times, and it provides an overview of implicit bias. And it was one of a series called Who Me? Biased. And this video is only available through the New York Times website. So in just a moment, I'm going to ask you to click on the link that will be showing up in your chat box, and you will be taken to the New York Times website. So this is our ADL's definition of implicit bias, and we define it as the unconscious attitudes, stereotypes, and unconscious attitudes, stereotypes, and unintentional actions, either positive or negative, towards members of a group merely because of their membership in that group. And really these associations develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning from a very early age. We absorb these messages from culture, from our family, our friends' families, educators, the media, etc. And oftentimes, as the video also says, these implicit biases actually are in direct conflict with our overt or understood values and perceptions of ourselves. So just to go a little bit deeper in understanding the difference between explicit and implicit bias. So explicit bias is characterized by actions that are intentional, voluntary, and the person engaging in the action is aware of their actions. And I wanted to share a recent example of this that happened in my hometown of Boston this spring. The Baltimore Orioles were playing the Red Sox, and a Baltimore player named Adam Jones, who is African American, was heckled, called racist epithets, and had peanuts thrown at him by Boston Red Sox fans at Fenway Park. Jones described this as one of the worst experiences in his 12 years in the major leagues. So this is really a clear example of explicit bias. So implicit bias, on the other hand, is involuntary and unintentional. And so the person is really unaware that they're being biased. And I wanted to share with you another example that happened this spring at Colgate University that you may have heard about. So a student reported to the campus security that there was an armed black man on campus, and the campus security director ordered a lockdown, and people scrambled to safety, and there was quite a bit of fear and mayhem and confusion. So this lockdown was in effect for 4 hours, and then it was lifted when authorities determined that the armed individual was in fact a black student who had a glue gun that he was using for a school project. Yeah. So the president of Colgate, in his letter to the community following the incident, wrote that, quote, "It is important that we understand the role that implicit bias held in the initial reporting of and responses to the events." So fortunately, the school community took the situation very seriously and has, in fact, been in contact with the Anti-Defamation League, my organization, and we've been offering support and guidance in the wake of this incident. I also just want to note that neither of these incidents I just described occurred in a vacuum. You know, there is a history of other black players experiencing racism at Fenway, and members of the Colgate community have alleged racial bias and insensitivity on that campus as well. So as the New York Times video stated, there is a fog that we all breathe, and the messages that we hear, the biased comments that go unchallenged, all of these things really foster a climate that is ripe for bias to spread and grow. So I want to just give you a little mini neurological explanation for implicit bias. I'm not a scientist, so this will be very rudimentary, but this slide here helps to illustrate what's going on. And basically, our brain processes very large amounts of information at any given time. And here, as we see, 11 million pieces of information any given moment. And a vast majority of this information is on the subconscious level. And then a very small portion reaches a conscious level. On both levels, though, really, our brain is working to make sense of what is coming in. So as humans, we're naturally trying to make sense of this high volume of information that we're receiving moment to moment. And so to do this, our brains have created mental shortcuts, or schemas is another name, that helps us to categorize information and then jump to conclusions at an unconscious or implicit level. So essentially, these schemas are a biological function that we developed over time as a survival mechanism. So back in the Serengeti, when we saw a tiger appear from the brush, we immediately associated that with danger, and our fight or flight instinct kicked in. So again, these in current times, we're seeing these same associations playing out with our relationships with others. So there's an excellent podcast called Hidden Brain, which just came out a couple weeks ago. It's produced by National Public Radio, and it was in the podcast there was a prominent researcher on implicit bias from Harvard University, Mahazareen Banaji, and she illustrated the point like this. So if I asked you to sort a deck of cards by putting all of the red cards in one pile and all of the black cards in one pile, you would perform this task in about 20 seconds. Now, suppose that I ask you to reshuffle the cards and sort them again, but this time you have to sort them by putting all the diamonds and spades in one pile and all the clubs and hearts in one pile. So do you think it would take you more time or less time to sort it? So we have a little poll here to see what you think. So what do you think happens to the time that it takes you to complete this task? Do you think the response time goes down, the response time goes up by 25%, the response time goes up by 50%, or the response time goes up by 100%? Okay, so it seems that the majority feels that the response time goes up by 50%. In fact, what we find is that the response time actually goes up by 100%. So it takes nearly double the amount of time to perform the task. And how do we explain this? Well, we're conditioned to sort by color. So you know that song, "One of these things is not like the other," that we learned in from Sesame Street. Well, so that rule of black and black go together and red go together is no longer available to us as a mental shortcut. So the first task was easy because there was a rule of association that we could rely on. But in the second task, you needed longer to complete it because that rule of thumb wasn't available to you. So when our brains make these same mental shortcuts with our humans, it influences our perceptions of others. And the researcher Mahazareen Banaji that I just mentioned from Harvard and some of her colleagues from the University of Virginia and the University of Washington founded Project Implicit back in 1998 that studies implicit bias and allows individuals to assess their levels of implicit bias. And they developed an online test called the Implicit Association Tool, or IAT. You may be familiar with it. And it really measures the test taker's response time to different associations, which gives us a window into implicit bias. So basically, we were acculturated with messages that white is good and black is bad. And so when we're faced with a situation that is incongruous to this message, then our brain has to pause and think, which causes a slower reaction time, just like we saw in the exercise with the playing cards. So over the years, they've collected millions of data points as people go on and do this survey, which is free, and I encourage you to do it yourself. It is very revealing. And here's what the data that they've found. The first one is that implicit biases are pervasive. They found that 75 to 80% of self-identified whites and Asian show an implicit preference for racially white people relative to racially black people. Also, people are often unaware of these biases. They harbor the negative associations, even though when they honestly report that they don't have these biases. Implicit bias does predict behavior. They found that those people with higher levels of implicit bias display greater discrimination. And there is some debate about this point, but a recent study by researcher Eric Hammond, did find that that there was a connection between higher levels of bias in communities and police shootings. So couple other recent surveys or studies that have been done. One that just came out a couple weeks ago from Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality that shows that, quote, black girls were more likely to be viewed as behaving and seeming older than their stated age, and that this dynamic plays out in girls as young as 5 years old. So that is a disturbing fact. There were also two recent studies done published by the American Psychological Association that found that African American and boys and men appear older and less innocent than their white counterparts, or perceived to be, I should say, less innocent and older. And another study that had participants, they were shown photos of white and black faces of males who were of equal height and weight, and then they were asked to estimate the height, weight, and strength of the men, and participants consistently perceived the black men to be larger and stronger and more muscular. So the implications for our students, and this is from the perspective of the students that are the victims of the implicit bias. There's a flip side to this. So students have less peer acceptance. White students, on the other hand, would experience greater peer acceptance. More student-to-student and student-to-teacher conflict, harsher and more frequent punishments. In that study that I just mentioned about the perceptions of girls of color gets into greater level of detail about that. There are lower expectations for academic performance and fewer opportunities that are offered to them. So what can we do? So as I mentioned, one tool is to actually take the test yourself. You can choose, there's a number of categories. You can choose race, gender, all sorts of different questions. It doesn't take long. It is anonymous. Another recommendation is to identify experiences that have shaped your own perceptions and assumptions. What were the messages that you learned growing up? As a white person, this really requires me to look at the advantages I've been given simply by being born with white skin and the sense that I belong and that I don't have to do the mental gymnastics that people of color have to do about situations in which they may not be treated respectfully. So also to make sure that your curriculum provides windows to the outside world, and so that they're learning about different ethnic and cultural groups. And I find that face-to-face interactions that increase intercultural understanding can really be one of the most effective ways to break down stereotypes. And then finally, to be a role model by refraining from judging others based on their aspect of their own identities. As we all know, our students are watching what we do and what we say. Okay, and then just looking quickly institutionally what we can do. I can't underemphasize enough the importance of sending a strong message about your school's values around diversity and inclusion. You could have signs at the front door welcoming people in different languages, displaying flags from countries that your students originate from, having a regular feature in your school newsletter, website, or parent communication that highlights efforts to promote inclusion and address bias. And importantly, if incidents of bias arise, and they do arise, they're arising quite frequently these days, I encourage you to really confront them head on and have an open dialogue and make it into a teachable moment rather than trying to brush it under the rug. The photo you see here is taken from the exterior wall of my son's school, and I see this as an example of really being purposeful and showing your school values. And so before you even set foot in the building, these values are there, and you're reminded of those, and they're constantly reinforced. So again, teaching about anti-bias principles and encouraging critical thinking about bias in your students. And then I encourage implicit bias training for all staff, and ADL and other organizations do offer this type of training for staff. And also to plan ongoing school-wide initiatives that go beyond just what we call the 3 F's of celebrating food, festivals, and famous people. They should be comprehensive and really happening on a regular basis, not just a once-a-year sort of thing. So ADL's website is here. We have a number of great resources for educators, from bibliography to free online resources, all kinds of great stuff. So that's it. I breezed through the end there. I know I was running out of time. You're welcome.
That's all right. It's actually an excellent, very much so an eye-opener. And the fact that the ADL does these workshops for schools and school districts, I do encourage people to reach out and see what ADL or a partner organization can do. And I especially like your point on teachers being very intentional in the classroom when issues arise. Be very purposeful. Pounce on those issues of bias or bullying or whatever it is head on. And I know this is something that Federico Salas Isnardi down in Texas, who's going to be joining us right now, brought up last year about teachers should not be neutral. If problems arise, if issues happen, you need to take a stand, and you do that to encourage this culture of respect, what he calls the culture of respect.